Are you going to read out loud? Yes, with a preface. Let me go close my door. See, you only see the top half of me, so I didn't bother changing my pajama pants. So just excuse that. It is not wine. That would be blasphemous for me to do that. It's actually someone just said something, but it's actually, I hear noises. It's actually blueberry and pomegranate juice. All right. There's a lot of dumb motherfuckers on this app. So this is what we're gonna do. You could share this live with some dipshit conservatives who don't understand anything. Oh, wait 1 second. This is a beautiful piece. Phenomenal. Anyways, today we'll be getting into capital with a preface by me. I'm one of Santa's exploited elves. Is that cranberry juice? No, it's blueberry and pomegranate juice. I think it fits the aesthetic. Alright, let's skip. There's 130 pages of introduction. Not reading any of that. I don't give a fuck what some German who read Capital has to say. Alright. What fucking page is this? 126. So chapter 1 of Capital delves into the commodity, segueing into the labor theory of value. There are components to a commodity. A commodity, in its simplest form, is comprised of use and exchange value. All commodities have to have an exchange value. Commodities are curated to fulfill human desire. Desires are needs, and synonym with needs, I suppose. Whether those, as Marx himself says, which we'll find out momentarily, whether those needs fit the stomach or the imagination, i.e. food or the arts, for example. So we'll just get into it. The two factors of the commodity: use value and value. Parentheses, substance of value, magnitude of value. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails appears as an immense collection of commodities. We'll delve into what a commodity is. By the way, Marx is responsible for the popularization of concepts like capitalism, the capitalist means of production. These are all Marxian concepts. He wasn't the one who actually curated them, but they only gained any sort of relevance as a result of this very work being published in 1867. The individual commodity appears as its elementary form. Our investigation therefore begins with the analysis of the commodity. The commodity is, first of all, an external object, a thing which, through its qualities, satisfies human needs of whatever kind. The nature of these needs, whether they arise, for example, from the stomach or the imagination, makes no difference. This is number 3, so this one is quite aggressive. I had aforementioned how commodities are not specific to, for example, a raw material. They could be anything, right? A computer is a commodity that satisfies my desire of creativity as opposed to bread, which is a need, right? Both are needs. This is why advertisers try to purport all sorts of commodities as being needs. They convince you of them being a need. You need to get the new PlayStation. All right. Nor does it matter here how the thing satisfies man's need, whether directly as a means of sustenance, i.e. an object of consumption, for example, food, or indirectly as a means of production. Every useful thing, for example, iron, paper, etc., may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. Every useful thing is a whole composed of many properties. It can therefore be useful in various ways. The discovery of these ways, and hence of the manifold use of things, is the work of history. So also is the invention of socially recognized standards of measurement for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of the measures for commodities arises in part from the diverse nature of the objects to be measured, and in part from convention. The usefulness of a thing makes it a use value. So, now we're getting into use value, the first component of the labor theory of value. But this usefulness does not dangle in midair. It is conditioned by the physical properties of the commodity and has no existence apart from the latter. So obviously, the utility of an object comes from the material condition of said object. It is therefore the physical body of the commodity itself. For instance, iron, corn, a diamond, which is the use value or useful thing. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. So, I'm trying to think of a way required to appropriate its useful qualities. So there are usefulness to X. I'm going to put it in variables. X is a commodity and it has a use value, how useful it is, right? And that is independent of the labor you put into it. It's useful because it has X property. This X physical property makes it useful. Like innately. Labor is a necessity to get it to the point of being useful. Basically, simplest terms imaginable. Something is useful. There are two components to a commodity. It is an object, which is useful and is exchangeable. I create it with the intent of exchanging, and it has a degree of useful utility. All right. When examining use values, we always assume we are dealing with definite quantities, such as dozens of watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. The use values of commodities provide the material for a special branch of knowledge, namely the commercial knowledge of commodities. So you go on Amazon and you know infinite amount. Like think of your brain as a catalog. You go on Amazon.com. You know of infinite amount of different types of commodities. We are in a commodity market. Like any consumer good is a commodity. Your mind is a catalog for the memorization of commodities. And the reason for that is because they have some sort of utility to them. Use values are only realized in use or in consumption. They constitute the material content of wealth, holy shit, whatever its social form may be. In the form of society to be considered here, they are also the material bearers of exchange value. Now, exchange value, which I've been alluding to, is finally entering into the equation. Exchange value appears, first of all, as the quantitative relation, the proportion in which use values of one kind exchange for use values of another kind. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. This relation changes constantly with time and place. Hence, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative and consequently an intrinsic value, i.e., an exchange value that is inseparably connected with the commodity inherent in it, seems a contradiction in terms. Let us consider the matter more closely. So no matter what the exchange value is, use values always have an exchange value. The usefulness of a commodity is always in juxtaposition or conjunction, I suppose, with an exchange value. Commodities are curated with the intent of an exchange because we have the division of labor in our market system. Can we know the author? Marx. All right, this part will explain it better. A given commodity, a quarter of wheat, for example, is exchanged for X boot polish, right? So X, just undefined variable, however amount. Y silk or Z gold. In short, it is exchanged for other commodities in the most diverse proportions. Therefore, the wheat has many exchange values instead of one. This is true. So, fun fact, everything that Marx says is true, except for the whole religion tangent, but that's okay. He can be wrong once, but everything he says in here it's true. That's just a little reminder. In short, it is exchanged for other commodities in the most diverse proportion. So I have a commodity. I have X commodity. Notebook. The exchange value of this differs. One notebook worth 3 eggs, but one notebook is worth 1 loaf of bread. That 1 loaf of bread is worth 3 eggs. See how exchange values work? All right. Therefore, the wheat has many exchange values instead of one. But X boot polish, Y silk, or Z gold, etc., each represent the exchange value of 1 quarter of wheat. That's how a market works. Exchange values are kind of universal in that capacity, I suppose. Because one notebook, let's say one notebook is worth 3 eggs and one notebook is worth 1 loaf of bread. 1 loaf of bread is then worth 3 eggs, right? The exchange value remains universal. Therefore, X boot polish, Y silk, Z gold, etc. must, as exchange values, be mutually replaceable. That's what I was just alluding to. Or of identical magnitude. It follows from this that, firstly, the valid exchange values of a particular commodity express something equal. And secondly, exchange value cannot be anything other than a mode of expression, the form of appearance, of a content distinguishable from it. I'm sweating all over this. Holy shit, dude. This book is so damaged from whoever owned it previously, which no one should have owned it previously. I bought it at fucking Barnes & Noble. Let us now take 2 commodities, for example, corn and iron. Whatever their exchange relation may be, it can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. For instance, 1 quarter of corn equals X count of iron. What does this equation signify? It signifies that a common element of identical magnitude exists in 2 different things, in 1 quarter of corn and similarly in X count of iron. Both are therefore equal to a third thing, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. This ties into my example of notebook, bread, egg, right? It's all coming back to this concept of the notebook, the egg, and bread. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third thing. TLDR, there's a synonym in the market, right? So, although as a result of exchange value, you can have something that is of a complete individual property of another thing, but what it is worth in its exchange value remains synonymous. Once again, the notebook is independent of the loaf of bread, which is independent of the egg. But if I go to a market, 1 notebook is worth 3 eggs. 1 notebook is worth 1 loaf of bread. If I exchange my notebook for a loaf of bread, and I go to a market, that 1 loaf of bread will be worth the 3 eggs because that's what the notebook was worth, right? There's an identical magnitude to exchange value. A simple geometrical example will illustrate this. In order to determine and compare the areas of rectilinear figures, we split them up into triangles. Then the triangle itself is reduced to an expression totally different from its visible shape. Half the product of the base and the altitude. In the same way, the exchange values of commodities must be reduced to a common element, of which they represent a greater or a lesser quantity. This common element cannot be a geometrical, physical, chemical, or other natural property of commodities. Such properties come into consideration only to the extent that they make the commodities useful, i.e. turn them into use values. But clearly the exchange relation of commodities is characterized precisely by its abstraction from their use values. Within the exchange relation, one use value is worth just as much as another, provided only that it is present in the appropriate quantity. Or as old Barbin says, that's definitely not how you pronounce that, my bad. One sort of wares are as good as another, if the value be equal. There is no difference or distinction in things of equal value. 100 pounds worth of lead or iron is of as great a value as 100 pounds of silver and gold. Not Ilia reading Claudia Conway's book. Yeah, so fun. Damn, Leah, calm the fuck down, bro. So basically, X variable remains through an economy. An economy centered around the commodity form, obviously. As use values, commodities differ above all in quality, while as exchange values, they can only differ in quantity, and therefore do not contain an atom of use value. If then we disregard the use value of commodities, only one property remains, that of being products of labor. Now here's the big takeaway. All commodities require labor, right? Or at least for the development of a commodity economy, a commodity-based economy, for the capitalist means of production. There might be things that supersede that, but not in a holistic prescription, and we'll get into that. But even if the product of labor has already been transformed in our hands, if we make abstraction from its use value, we abstract also from the material constituents and forms which make it a use value. It is no longer a table, a house, a piece of yarn, or any other useful things. All its sensuous characteristics are extinguished, nor is it any longer the product of the labor of the joiner, the mason, or the spinner, or any of the particular kind of productive labor. With the disappearance of the useful character of the products of labor, the useful character of the kinds of labor embodied in them also disappears. This in turn entails the disappearance of the different concrete forms of labor. They can no longer be distinguished, but are altogether reduced to the same kind of labor, human labor in the abstract. This is why Marx makes this distinction between abstract and concrete labor. Let us now look at the residue of the products of labor. There is nothing left of them in each case but the same phantom-like objectivity. They are merely congealed quantities of homogeneous human labor, i.e. of human labor power expended without regard to the form of its expenditure. All these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended to produce them. Human labor is accumulated in them. As crystals of this social substance, which is common to them all, they are values, commodity values. Reading along, I love to see it, Gannon. I'm taking sip breaks. We have seen that when commodities are in the relation of exchange, their exchange value manifests itself as something totally independent of their use value. But if we abstract from their use value, there remains their value, as it has just been defined. All right, some of these concepts get really, really hard. So this is a mistake that's commonly made. I'm on page 128, last paragraph. I'm bookmarking this for the time being. We'll do something that'll help comprehend this to a million times. So we'll listen to a professor make Marx more digestible, and then I'll make the professor making Marx more digestible. So I will be playing this in 2 times speed. Just don't pay attention really to what he has to say, because I'll just be TLDRing it, I suppose. All right. Let's go to output. Holy shit, bro, just play. All right.
I think it's important to ask them, why did Marx start with an analysis of the commodity? Why was it not something else? Why did he not begin with capital or wage labour or any of these other things that seem so important to capitalism? Well, so that although commodities existed before capitalism, it was to a very much limited degree. And it's actually the production and exchange of commodities which forms the basis of what Marx called the capitalist mode of production, i.e. capitalism. Now, Marx actually states in the opening sentence of Capital that wealth under capitalism appears as an immense collection of commodities, with the individual commodity being its elementary form. And I'll say, well, how true is this today? Go into any big supermarket like Asda and Tesco, you'll find tens of thousands of commodities there on the shelves. And that's actually nothing. I looked at the figures. As of January this year, Amazon.com sold a total of 398 million commodities through its website. And that's mostly consumer goods. Think as well of all the raw materials, all the actual machines and so on that are sold around the world on the market. And we really are truly talking about an immense collection of commodities.
So TLDR, basically, Marx illustrates that the capitalist mode of production is centered around a commodity, right? Commodities are found everywhere. He just said himself, you go into Tesco, it's abundant of all commodities, right? You don't really have to pay attention to him. I'm just listening to him to what he has to say, because he makes this more digestible. And if he makes this more digestible, I can make him more digestible, and then that makes it easier for the bottom of the barrel. Now, a lot of people are asking you, asking themselves, I suppose, what is a commodity, right? So right now, get your little notebook or whatever, or like take notes in your head. Right now, we're on the page of commodities exist. Commodities are at the centerpiece of the capitalist mode of production. They're abundant everywhere. Now we're getting into what is a commodity.
So the commodity, therefore, is like the basic cell of capitalism. You need to understand what a commodity is, and also crucially, what determines its value, in order to be able to understand the rest of the functioning of the capitalist system. Now, so for all this talk of commodities, what actually are they? Well, if you look in the business press, like the Financial Times, or some kind of economics textbooks, you'll see reference to commodity markets. And by this, they're talking about exchange of things like coal, oil, wheat, steel, and things like this. And these are things that are really not finished goods, but are inputs into later production processes.
Yeah, so like the average capitalist views a commodity, or I suppose like more traditional economic outlook is like commodity being something that is a not finished good. So if you like read an economics textbook, like maybe a Krugman textbook, it would be like, oh, a commodity is a good that is not finished, something raw, like iron, right? Fun fact, they're wrong. We'll get into that.
Well, Marx's understanding of commodity was actually much broader than this. It's not just unfinished goods. So forget what you've read in the business press or economics textbooks. Firstly, Marx points out that commodity must be a product of labour. Now, this can be a tangible good, something you can actually physically hold, whether it's like this book or the table, or it can be a service provided.
Number 1, first quality of a commodity must be a product of labor. We'll get into what constitutes labor, what is a concept of labor, divisions of labor. Commodity must be a product of labor.
Such as a haircut, or if I was going to repair your car, for example. And so for all the talk...
Oh, yeah. It doesn't have to be like a material good, like he said himself. It could be like something of a service nature, like a haircut.
Table, or it can be a service provided, such as a haircut, or if I was going to repair your car, for example. And so for all the talk about Marx not being relevant in Britain or advanced capitalist countries nowadays due to the decline of heavy industry, I'll say that's not true. Services are still produced and exchanged as commodities under capitalism. Note as well that it's not something that you just find for free in nature. So it's not like picking wildflowers from a meadow or blackberries from a park. It's the product of labour. Second and crucially, a commodity must be something that's produced for exchange.
Part 2. This is what we were getting in with the book. Did you watch the video before? A couple years ago, I think. Or not a couple years ago. Like last year, I suppose. So, commodity is something that needs to be exchanged. There. There's your second bullet point, right? Or developed with the intent of exchange, too.
It is not produced to satisfy the needs of its own producer, but to...
There he says himself. It is not produced to satisfy. It is not produced to satisfy the needs of its own producer. It's produced with the presupposition of it being exchanged.
Satisfy somebody else's needs. And that's really the distinguishing feature that separates commodities from other forms of goods and services produced in different modes of production.
So yeah, that's what distinguishes, that's one quality that distinguishes commodities from other means of production. It is curated for the intent of exchange.
For example, if you take an early tribal society, they still had to produce items necessary for their own existence, things like clothing, tools, and shelter, and so on. But these things were socially produced, with the total wealth belonging to the entire tribe. And there was no need for the exchange of goods between individual members of the tribe, as they would have all just simply taken what they needed out of that store of common wealth.
So in other means of production, so like let's say 200 years ago, you're a Native American, right? You produce things collectively with no intent of exchange because you live in a communal society, right? So I produce a coat and then that goes into the reserve and anyone can take it according to their need. That is not a commodity because that is not curated with an exchange. You are part of a collective. This is not me exchanging X for Y as Marx detailed. This is just me producing something to satisfy a need without the concept of an exchange value. Commodities need to have this concept of exchange.
But Marx notes that it's only the products of mutually independent acts of labor performed in isolation that can confront each other as commodities.
So, as he said, Marx views it as something that needs to be independent acts of labor. Marx believes in a division of labor.
Otherwise, there's no need to exchange them if you can all take freely. So in order for commodity production to develop, it requires this emergence of a division of labor in society. So rather than everybody being involved in the joint production of goods in the tribe, you get a specialization. Some people become weavers, some people become cooks, some people...
Division of labor is everywhere. Someone is a welder, someone is an accountant, as opposed to communal societies in the past where we all live in like we all coincide with each other, I suppose, in like almost a tribalistic manner, right? In a commune of some sorts. And we do not curate things with the intent of exchange. We do not specialize in some hyper-specific field of labor. We are living communally to satisfy each other's needs. As opposed to in a capitalist mode of production, think about it. Just, I create a book. I make books for a living. And then this has an exchange value. And then when I go to a market, I exchange that for currency, and that can be used to get other commodities. As opposed to, as he said himself, in communal societies, let's say in a tribe, we make coats, we put them in a reserve, people take according to their need. There's no exchange, right? There's no universal exchange.
People become blacksmiths, and so on, with all the different tasks that society performs.
That is because of the division of labor in a capitalist society as a result of specialization with the commodity form, as opposed to just the nature of communes.
How you get this division of labor? Now that doesn't happen overnight, but it takes a long process of development, which I don't really have time to go into. However, although we've had commodity production in earlier forms of society, including slavery and feudalism, it's only under that commodity production formed only a very small part of the production of society. The vast majority of goods were produced either for personal consumption, for example, in the case of peasant farmers who were produced for themselves and their own families. So
like subsistence farming, that is not a commodity, right? Because you are producing food for yourself, right? If I farm to produce for myself, that's not me engaging in some sort of commodity market. There's no exchange value there. I'm not exchanging anything, right? That's why like feudal times will not be regarded as a capitalist means of production because there's no commodity as the centerpiece of exchange.
Or they were directly appropriated by the ruling class themselves. So
cash crops are a commodity because you have the extent of exchange, right? Whoever said cash crops is a commodity? Yeah, because you're exchanging it for the medium of currency so that you can get other commodities.
For example, in the case of peasant farmers who were produced for themselves and their own families, or they were directly appropriated by the ruling class themselves, so slave owners and feudal lords, without any exchange in return.
And I suppose what many people would refer to as ruling classes under feudal systems, they were not engaging in a commodity market because they just take a portion of your crops without some sort of exchange value of like a 1-to-1 ratio of something. I am a feudal lord. It's my God-given right to just take crops from you. There's no exchange value there. It's not a commodity market.
It's only under capitalism that commodity production becomes generalized. The vast majority of goods and services are produced not for individual consumption, but for exchange on the market. So how
So would doing a favor be a commodity? What do you mean doing a favor?
then would you understand the value of a commodity?
Like,
Marx explains that commodities have
probably not.
It's only under capitalism that commodity production becomes generalized. The vast majority of goods and services are produced not for individual consumption, but for exchange on the market. So how then are we to understand the value of a commodity? Marx explains that commodities have a dual nature, and it makes a crucial distinction between, on the one hand, the use value of a commodity and its exchange value. Now, he notes that all commodities, through their properties, must satisfy some kind of social need.
Yeah. So the commodities just don't spiral out of nowhere. Commodities are curated with satisfying some sort of social need.
They must be an object of utility, and in this sense, they're a use value. If they weren't useful, nobody would buy them. They would find nobody to exchange.
So, as Marx outlined in the first few pages, all commodities, in the simplest form right now, commodities are curated with the intent of exchange. They have an exchange value, but if you're exchanging something, it has to be useful, right? I'm not gonna fucking bring you my piss and expect 40 loaves of bread in return, right? There has to be a use value. This is something that needs to be socially necessary. No one wants my piss, so that's not socially necessary.
Them with. This use value is based on the physical properties of the object itself. So, for example, this table is useful because it is solid. It can support lots of weight. It's stable. It holds things up. It doesn't fall over. Alternatively, this T-shirt is useful because it has the property of being able to retain heat and so on. It doesn't matter what kind of need that is satisfied, or indeed how that need is satisfied. Marx says it doesn't matter whether it's a need arising from the stomach, such as the need for food to stop you starving, or from the imagination. So, as in a need that's not necessary to keep you alive.
So use value derives from the physical nature of an object. This is useful because I can drink it, I can consume it. My computer is useful because it fulfills the desires of my mind. I can game or whatever the fuck, right?
But it can become a need. So take, for example, today, a mobile phone or luxury goods such as jewelry. You don't need it to stay alive, but it becomes a need in any event. And this puts to bed these ideas that somehow Marxist economics is not relevant today, as we're simply all buying consumer goods that we don't really need. Well, Marx explained it doesn't matter. Needs can be created. And you can see this in the trillions of pounds spent on advertising agencies to try and convince us that we need certain products, such as makeup or cigarettes or a razor with 7 blades. Now, once commodity production is developed, you find that certain commodities exchange in certain definite ratios with one another. They have what Marx calls an exchange value. Now, Marx gives the example in Capital of a quantity of wheat exchanging for a certain quantity of iron, but it could be any commodities at all, whether it's tins of beans, loaves of breads, computers, cars, or...
So, once again, going back to the concept of all commodities have a use value and an exchange value. They're useful, and then we exchange them for other commodities, and that's the exchange value in juxtaposition with the use value.
Anything else that's exchanged. Now, what is it that makes these commodities exchange in certain ratios with one another? Why is it that I would have to exchange 3 tins of baked beans for 1 loaf of bread, or 300 loaves of bread for 1 computer? Now, of course, we're exchanging different use values. They all satisfy different needs in different ways, but it's not the usefulness of a thing that determines why it exchanges in these certain defined ratios. What makes a tin of beans useful? Primarily, it's its quality as a food. It stops you from going hungry and starving. You might also consider things like its taste or its longevity. But why does it take 3 of them then to exchange for 1 loaf of bread? Is one loaf of bread more or less useful? How would you quantify it? Some people may say, well, bread is tastier. Others would disagree. It's subjective. But a tin of beans, okay, it lasts longer, but it could therefore be seen as more useful. But it's always cheaper than a loaf of bread. Why is that? But here we're talking about both beans and bread. They both ultimately satisfy the same need, i.e. to keep us fed. But what about the computer or the car? Now, it's obvious that their usefulness differs, not quantifiably. And you can't measure usefulness objectively according to some kind of single scale. You can't have a measuring device like a thermometer and put it against a commodity and then suddenly work out exactly how useful it is. The difference is qualitative. It's because they have different qualities that they satisfy different needs.
Okay, yeah. So exchange value persists within a society, right? But where does exchange value come from? That's the question that he's asking. Why are 5 loaves of bread worth 1 pair of headphones? Why is that the case? Well, that's because usefulness, although it is subjective, is a qualitative nature. So people socially, this is why Marx always goes back into the concept of social necessity. People might, in certain instances, view bread as more socially necessary or headphones as more socially necessary than bread, right? And as a result of that, there's a higher exchange value for headphones as opposed to loaves of bread. One is going to be always more expensive than the other.
So what actually is it then that all commodities do have in common? Well, if you disregard the specific useful functions of each of them, it's that they are all the products of human labor.
So obviously all commodities thus far have an exchange value. They're created with the purpose of exchange. They have a use value. You have to be useful in order to be exchanged for something that is useful. Right? And now we're getting into the third bullet point. labor. They all derive from labor.
How can we compare them quantifiably by the very fact that different amounts of labour have gone into their production? But Marx wasn't the first to put forward the idea that labour is the source of value. As Rob explained, classical economists before him, such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo, also held to this view.
Yeah, other economists believe in the labor theory of value before the labor theory of value was really a thing.
But unlike them, Marx didn't look at value just from the point of view of the individual.
Luxury items are commodities. And just think about it this way. Is a luxury item useful? Does it have a use value? Yes. Is it exchanged? Does it have an exchange value? Yes. Boom.
Individual producer, such as a mason or the weaver, but he saw human labour is in the abstract.
So can humans become commodities? We sold slaves, didn't we? Slaves were sold for hundreds of years.
Just from the point of view of the individual producer, such as the mason or the weaver, but he saw...
For a while, humans were considered to be a type of means of production, right?
But unlike them, Marx didn't look at value just from the point of view of the individual producer, such as the mason or the weaver, but he saw human labour is in the abstract, i.e. society's labour in general. Now, as mentioned earlier, society is characterised by commodity production. It's based on a division of labour. So different people perform different kinds of labour. You could be, for example, a carpenter, a mason, or a weaver, or whatever. And they all perform different concrete kinds of labour, joining, building, weaving, to produce different kinds of use values, such as tables, houses, and cloth. But when considering exchange value, since we're abstracting away from the different uses and considering commodities only from the view of their common social substance, i.e. labour, we also abstract away from them the different concrete kinds of labour that went into their production. So tables, houses, and cloth are no longer the products of carpenters, masons, and weavers, but of human labour in the abstract. And this flows from the...
So basically what he's trying to get at here is that there's like the concept of human labor in the abstract. So a table or like a piece of cloth isn't like... It is valuable because of its labor, but that labor also derives from another person's labor, right? So let's say I take steel and then I make it into an engine, and then you take that engine and then you make it into a car. That derives from other human labor, right? As opposed to just a raw good. So it kind of, commodity markets build on themselves in that manner.
The dual nature of the commodities.
How can they be exchanged without a middleman? That's the problem. There's not supposed to be an exchange value to begin with.
On one hand, it has a use value because labour of a...
Can we slow it down? No, because this is actually a pretty bad lecture. Like, he stutters a lot. He smacks a lot. He gets words confused a lot. It's only of any use in 2 times speed, so I can just explain it in simpler terms. Because this lecture itself is really, really bad. It's just the simplest. Like, a lot of people in chat don't really like understand a lot of these concepts. So I'd actually rather people not watch this, but...
Specific concrete kind has gone into it, giving it certain physical quality.
What isn't a commodity? So commodity, like examples of things, it's hard to come across them in a capitalist society because almost everything is a commodity. But commodities, once again, require use value, exchange value, and have labor input. If they don't have exchange value, there's no commodity, like it's not a commodity, right? If I'm not curating it with the intent to exchange, which is the pinnacle of a commodity, then it's not a commodity. As I said earlier, in communal societies, I create a coat not for the purpose of an exchange, but just to better the commune, right? I put it into the reserve and then people just take according to their need as opposed to according to an exchange, a societal exchange, right? Instead of, one coat for one baked potato or whatever the fuck. It's just a communal style of living, right? It's subsistence farming is not a commodity. If I am farming to keep myself alive, that's not partaking in a commodity market.
But it has an exchange value, says human labour in the abstract has gone into it. When considering human labour in the abstract, we're reducing different kinds of labour involving different levels of skill down to a kind of simple average labour. And so more complex labour is simply considered as a different multiple of simple or unskilled labour. And simple average labour, Marx points out, isn't something that's fixed and eternal throughout all of human history, but it varies between different countries and different cultural epochs. But if you consider it at one point of time, it is in society as given. Now, exchange value isn't something natural and inherent to the commodity. You can't dissect a commodity, you can't cut it apart and find its value in there. You can't look at it under a microscope and discover it. However, it does exist, so not as a physical property of the commodity itself, but as a social property. And this should be obvious when you consider that use values such as clothes and tools have existed throughout human existence. But it's only under certain social conditions, a certain mode of production, once they're exchanged as commodities, that they acquire an exchange value.
There we go. I'll put that one a bit slower because that sentence was one of the only ones that he beautifully said.
Exchange value isn't something at one point of time, it is in society as given. Now, exchange value isn't something natural or inherent to the commodity. You can't dissect a commodity, you can't cut it apart and find its value in there. You can't look at it under a
So, like, the usefulness of an object is obviously subjective. That's what he's trying to get at.
microscope and discover it. However, it does exist. So not as a physical property of the commodity itself, but as a social property. And this should be obvious when you consider that use values such as clothes and tools have existed throughout human existence.
Use value is always persistent, right? Things have always been useful. Coats were useful thousands of years ago. But why are they commodities now as opposed to when they weren't commodities?
But it's only under certain social conditions, a certain mode of production, once they're exchanged as commodities, that they acquire an exchange value.
Once they are exchanged as commodities, they become commodities. The exchange value is what really makes it a commodity. Now, if I don't put this in 2 times speed, I'm going to go insane because this dude is actually dog shit at public speaking.
So this is a social property of these commodities. How can we determine it then? Well, I'd say the clue is in the name. It's through the act of exchange that this value becomes apparent. However, it's not based on a single act of exchange, and nor is it determined by the labour of an isolated producer. So if I produce coats for a living, and I want to exchange these coats for a living, and I want to exchange these coats with someone who produces shoes, that single act of exchange, that I swap a coat for a pair of shoes, doesn't determine the value of coats and shoes in general. Under capitalism, where commodity exchange is universal and generalised, commodities are not exchanged between individuals, but through the medium of the market.
In capitalism, commodities are not exchanged through individuals, but rather the means of the market. This is why we have a currency, right? So that we can make exchange values more universal. It would be a fucking nuisance to go to the store with a gallon of water and try to barter with people for loaves, right? That's why we have a medium. 1 gallon of water is $1. $1 or Snickers. Snickers is $1. I could also get fucking peanut M&Ms for $1, right? I use a medium to make this has an exchange value that is equal to a Snickers exchange value. But I also want to just have a medium so that the transfer of commodities is infinitely easier for me.
The actual producers and consumers of commodities rarely, if in fact ever, actually meet each other in person. You don't get to ask the shopkeeper how much labour was spent in the production of commodities on the shelf. So when you go into a shop like Tesco, you're confronted with many of the same commodities standing behind each other on the shelf, whether it's vegetables, meat, clothes or TVs. Therefore, the individual character of the actual specific labour that went into the production of each one of these items is lost. So despite putting the name of a farmer on a packet of carrots, all you really see is just a bunch of carrots of various sizes and shapes.
So what he's trying to get at right now is that despite you not seeing the labor process that goes into something, the labor process is what makes it valuable, right? So a gallon of water cannot be a gallon of water without my labor, right? I have to make the fucking plastic thing, purify the water, right? So that it has a use value as a raw material, but it cannot be valuable until I put labor into it to take it from a raw good and make it a commodity, right? So as a result of that, the socially necessary labor time is what makes it valuable. So right now we know that there's use value to things and that there's an exchange value. X raw good is useful if I take it to the market and exchange it for something. But to get from X to Y, to get from the useful nature of the object to its exchangeable medium, I have to put labor. There's Z, right? So this gallon of water in within itself is not valuable until I, 1, take the water, bottle the water, purify the water, whatever it may be, and make it exchangeable. That's why labor is what is making the commodity valuable, right? This is why capitalism is theft, because my labor is what is making this commodity valuable. And if a capitalist just exploits my labor, if I am responsible for 100% of the labor, right? If I am the worker in a factory and I make a car, I take the raw goods, engage in the labor process, socially necessary labor time, and then it ends in the exchanged medium of the product. My labor is what made it valuable there, right? What does the capitalist do? He just says, oh, but you're in my factory, so now let me take part of this despite the fact that he never had anything to do with the labor process, which made it valuable. If I'm responsible for 100% of the value and the capitalist takes 20% of that for no other reason than he owns the means of production, that is definitionally theft. All right, I don't even know if the rest of this lecture is worth watching.
Or t-shirts or TVs, you don't know how exactly they were produced. So how then do we measure and compare?
And then there's the meme of a mud pie, right? Well, what if I just dig around? What if I just dig around and make mud pies all day? And I put a lot of labor into, but that's not valuable. This is because Marx says socially necessary, right? Commodity has use value and exchange value. It has to be useful and it has to be exchangeable. No one wants mud pies. Marx did not ignore supply and demand. Marx recognizes supply and demand. Maybe he goes into this in this lecture. I'm pretty sure he does. So as a result of this, things have to be useful for labor, right? They have to be useful for the labor to be valuable. But everything that is useful because of the labor that is put into it. So it's like the concept of not all rectangles are squares, but all squares are rectangles or whatever, right? Not all labor is useful, but everything that is useful as a result of labor. Not all labor is useful, but everything that is useful is as a result of labor.
The general abstract human labour that went into their production. It's simply by its duration. It's by the time that it was spent in the production of these commodities. But note, since we're talking about exchange value, or rather from now on I'll simply call it value, of a commodity, it's not based on the actual individual labour that went into it, but it's based on the amount of labour required to produce such a given commodity in general.
That is an important distinction to make. It is not useful because, all right, this is a bit of a more nuanced concept. How do we arrive at socially necessary labor time, right? We don't just take individuals and say, oh, it took you 5 hours. All right, that's socially necessary. No, you take how much it generally takes to produce an item, and that is what is socially necessary. So for example, let's say the socially necessary labor time to make a car is 2 hours. If some dipshit takes 5 hours to make the car, it doesn't make it more valuable because that's not socially necessary labor time. That's just wasting time. 2 hours is what the general is. So as a result of that, that is what the socially necessary labor time is for that product.
That's an important point, because the exchange value is therefore determined not by the individual labour that went into it, but by the socially necessary labour time required in general to produce such a commodity. Marx notes that this is determined by the conditions of production which are normal for a given society, including the average degree and skill and intensity of labour prevalent in that society, i.e. what we call the productivity of labour. As such, value is not something that's fixed and eternal to a commodity, but it changes with time and place due to certain historical and social conditions. So, for example, when you go into a shop, you don't ask or care about how much time went in producing a particular article. All that matters really is the time required on average, given the normal conditions of production. So, imagine that you're at a street market and there's a market stall with 2 boxes of peppers for sale. They're pretty much exactly the same.
How do we define socially necessary time? Well, in a capitalist system, it's literally just relegated upon supply and demand.
Peppers, but one was offered for sale for double the price of the other. Now the seller says, well, these are more valuable since double the amount of time unfortunately went into their production. But
right, I'll actually slow it down for this one because maybe he doesn't do a piss poor job of explaining this.
That you're,
all right, here.
But it changes with time and place due to certain historical care about how much time went in producing a particular article. All that matters really is the time required on average given the normal conditions of production.
Time required on average given the normal means of production is socially necessary labor time.
So imagine that you're at a street market and there was a market stall with 2 boxes of peppers for sale. They're pretty much exactly the same peppers, but one was offered for sale for double the price of the other. Now the seller says, well, these are more valuable since double the amount of time unfortunately went into their production. Unfortunately, we had a slower set of workers picking them and harvesting them, so that's why I'm going to charge more. Well, of course, you would say, no thanks, I'm going to buy the cheaper ones. And the ones produced by these slower workers are going to remain unsold. Hence, sellers on the market, which today is very much a global market, average level of skill, technology and organization.
So given an aggregate, the aggregate is what you use to necessitate a socially necessary labor time, right? The average amount of time given the normal means of production is what socially necessary labor time is. I don't even know if there's anything useful left in this lecture. It's been so long since I watched it. I'm trying to think.
In their branch of industry. If they don't, they're going to be forced out of business. So nobody is therefore calculating exactly how much labour went into the production of each commodity. There's no one there from trading standards at each stage of production of a stopwatch. You're measuring the amount of time put into it. It's through competition on the market.
Yeah, through competition of a market. That is what is designated as socially necessary labor time in capitalism.
That forces commodities to be produced according to their socially necessary labour time. So capitalism therefore produces a drive to develop the productivity of labour. And we're going to consider this in much more detail in one of the later sessions today. But I think the important thing to understand now is that in doing so, if labour is more productive, if we're able to produce a greater mass of use values in the same duration of time, society becomes more wealthy. We have more use values to go around. But at the same time, each individual commodity becomes less valuable in itself. It has a lower exchange value since less socially necessary labour time has gone into its production. So.
If something is said to take 2 hours and something does it faster, does that change anything? Well, that happens in history all the time, right? If I find, so for example, Eli Whitney, what was his name? Eli something. Remember the cotton gin, right? So cotton was valuable during slavery. It was worth X amount of money because it took slaves to produce. It took slaves Y amount of time to produce it, and then that's what caused it to be worth X amount of money, right? And then Eli Whitney comes out with the cotton gin, and it decreases the amount of labor time needed to produce cotton, right? So as a result of that, it makes it less valuable, right? Way less time put into it. Socially necessary labor time is way less. You produce way more. So as a result of that, the socially necessary labor time decreases. The labor theory of value is very demonstrable in reality.
For an example of this, you have the development of the power loom.
So he gives an example of this that isn't too shitty. We'll listen to it.
Necessary labour time has gone into its production. So for an example of this, you had the development of the power loom a few centuries ago, when in a 10-hour day, for example, you were able to produce double the amount of cloth that could be woven previously by hand using a hand loom. So if I take an arbitrary figure, you might get 100 square meters of cloth produced in a day rather than 50. Now, society is clearly wealthier in the fact that in 1 day's labour, you now have double the amount of cloth produced. You have more use values. But the actual exchange value produced in 1 day, as in the value, is still the same. It's still the product of 1 day's labour. However, that value is now spread across double the amount of cloth. So each square metre of cloth now represents half as much value as before. So those using a hand loom don't get to sell their...
Not the smacking. Yeah, it drives me insane. That's why I usually listen to it in 2 times.
Cloth at the old rate, i.e. for double its now current value, as that produced by power loom. Now only half of their labour represents the socially necessary labour time required for the production of cloth.
Now only half of their labour represents the socially necessary labour time.
And this is really something that mainstream economists either don't understand or cannot explain, because they confuse use value and exchange value. Because they think everything is determined by its utility. How can something become less valuable but be just as useful? Now this leads us on to the question of price, which we mustn't confuse with that value or exchange value. And if you look at the prices of commodities, they fluctuate. Sometimes they're increasing, sometimes they decrease. And also at the same time, you can go into different shops and find different prices for exactly the same commodity. Does this mean that those specific commodities have different underlying values? I say no, price is only the monetary expression of value, and it fluctuates.
Yeah. So people oftentimes do conflate price and value. They're like, oh, well, I don't even know like an analogy for this. An apple costs $9 in Japan, but it costs $1 here, right? Labor theory of value debunked, right? Like if it was labor that was making it valuable, then like labor remains consistent in the economies, but price is different. Price is separate from value. The problem with price is it fluctuates because it is a representation of the capital is centered around supply and demand. Value still remains constant.
It's around its value according to the laws of supply and demand. So obviously if supply is short and demand is high, prices will increase above their values. If supply is high and demand is low, prices will decrease below their values. And this very mechanism of supply and demand produces a certain equilibrium. You can see prices...
This is why, for example, old wines are more valuable than newer wines. They're not more valuable. There's not more value to them. They're just more expensive because of supply and demand, right? If there was a means to make old wines the same, like if you could put more labor and get an old wine, like if you could get a new wine and then make it an old wine with labor, that would like not be the case then. But as a result of the fact that there's a supply and demand, and there's a limited supply, but a higher demand, that's what makes it more valuable in its price, right? That doesn't reflect on the labor theory of value.
Oscillating around an average, providing that the productivity of labor and other factors remain constant. And that average, when supply and demand therefore cancel each other out over a given period of time, is linked therefore to the underlying value of the commodities. This question of price is frequently used by capitalist economists to try and rubbish Marxist economics and say,
yeah, there you go. They say, oh, supply and demand. Ooh, how come this is worth more or less?
It doesn't work. They say, well, what about things that no labor has gone into, like a virgin forest? How can that have a price? Well, Marx never denied that it's possible for things that are not the product of labor to actually be offered as sale, and therefore through their price they take on a commodity form. But it takes a certain development of society, i.e. of private property rights, of commodity production and of money, for this to even be possible.
So if you create a whole commodity market, there could be exceptions to a rule where like there are things that are valuable in their price with nothing else. Like maybe as a result of the fact that they are they could be a means of production. So like land, for example.
But once this is the case, all sorts of things can be offered for sale. For example, if you go back to the medieval period, the church used to actually sell what they called indulgences. And for a certain price, they would absolve you of any sin that you happen to commit. But I would say, if you take commodity production as a whole, these sort of things are extremely rare and isolated, and are therefore kind of an unusual or kind of like fringe element of the economy. Likewise, how is it that certain items can fetch enormous sums of money, such as works of art or fine wines, which seem to have nothing to do with the amount of labour that actually went into their production?
That's what we were just talking about.
Well, it doesn't invalidate the labour theory of value. We have to be clear that here we're dealing with unique or extremely scarce items, and they can't be produced through the application of more labour.
So as a result of the fact that old wine cannot just be created if I put more labor into it, in a capitalist mode of production, it is viewed as more valuable because they operate under supply and demand, right? It's more valuable in its price as a result of the fact that it is more scarce. But what made it valuable to begin with was the labor input, right? But just in a capitalist mode of production, commodities fluctuate in their supply, and as a result of that, if there's less supply, they're more expensive in price. That doesn't actually make it any more or less valuable.
Their price cannot be brought down through competition. As such, the demand can vastly outstrip the supply, leading to extremely high prices, i.e. monopoly prices. So Marx's labour theory of value, the value of commodities is determined by the socially necessary labour time that goes into their production. Here we're dealing with commodities that can be produced or reproduced without restrictions. We must also be clear that when we're dealing with the labour theory of value, we're not dealing with isolated acts of exchange between individuals, such as at an art auction, but we're dealing with generalised commodity exchange over the course of the whole global market. Now, Marx spends a good deal...
Can you debunk the ECP? Most people on this app don't actually understand the ECP. I don't really understand what the problem with linear programming is. I've asked people. Yesterday on stream, I asked Verbal. I was like, do you know the problem with linear programming? He was like, no. He was like, there are other people that do know. I have yet to meet them. But even if the ECP is a thing, it literally doesn't matter. It has no ethical implication upon how unethical capitalism is.
Of chapter 1 explaining the development of exchange value, how it in fact begins precisely with these isolated acts of exchange between individuals through the process of barter, where in fact the ratio of goods exchanged can appear accidental, all the way through to a general form of exchange value, where through the acts of millions of exchanges of commodities, the value of any one commodity can be expressed in relation to all others. And this requires the development of money, which acts as a kind of universal equivalent, a commodity that can be exchanged with all other commodities.
It literally doesn't matter. No, it actually literally does not matter. Yes, because if my critique of capitalism is not one of economics, but rather of something of an ethical nature, if I can prove that capitalism is unethical, then the ECP has no implication upon the ethical nature of capitalism.
And therefore gives expression to their values. But with barter, the exact ratios that commodities exchanging can be more or less with each exchange, they appear accidental. But with the generalization of commodity exchange, each individual act of exchange loses its individual character and becomes one of thousands of exchanges on the markets. Therefore, these ratios average out. They begin to confront buyers and sellers on the market as prices. And importantly, these are not of their choosing, but appear as established fact.
Furthermore, if we get into Marxian crisis theory, for every one critique of the application of post-capitalist schools of thought, I could give you 3 critiques of capitalism. If we just start with chapter 13, if we just get into the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is literally demonstrable, I could send you studies on this. You can cope, you could just deny the TSSI, you could just go down the Kishio route, even though he's been completely annihilated as well. It's just like, it's so irrelevant to anything.
Representing ultimately the socially necessary labor time that goes into their production, i.e. their exchange value. For example, when you go into a supermarket, you don't haggle over the prices of the things that are on the shelves. Or even in areas of the market where you might be expected to haggle, the price that you haggle around isn't arbitrary. In fact, you come to generally know the going rate of things. Now, Marx says, in the midst of the accidental and ever-fluctuating exchange relations between the products, the labor time socially necessary to produce them asserts itself as a regulative law of nature.
How to reply when someone says communism is unrealistic? Pragmatism doesn't take away from ethical truths. So slavery was unethical, right? And this is directly analogous, just having this conversation. So let's say we have a conversation, right? In this conversation, I say, capitalism is inherently unethical. Here's why. Blah, 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 blah. You agree with me. You're like, wow, that is pretty unethical. I'm like, okay, so you're a communist now. No, I just don't think communism is realistic. Scenario B. It's 1700. We're in the South in America. Hey, dude, I think slavery is unethical. Oh, really? Why is that? Well, here's reason 1, here's reason 2. And then your response is, well, I just don't think that slavery cannot exist. I mean, slavery is in human nature. Slavery has existed for the last 2,000 years. It's been the status quo. So let's just continue with the status quo. Normalcy has no implication upon ethics. Guess in that second conversation, who's going to be remembered? The 1%. The abolitionists, right? The ones who are like, hey, this slavery shit is whack. Let's get rid of it. That's the ones we learn about as being objectively correct. Not the dipshits who are like, well, actually, I don't think it's realistic to escape the current state. Well, did you know actually the status quo is upholding something unethical? It's not an argument by any metric.
Look, this law is not something that's timeless or imposed from without, but emerges from the interactions within. Once commodity exchange reaches a certain level of development, it becomes generalized. Importantly, Marx explains how this law becomes mystified, how it becomes obscured. Rather than understanding value as ultimately a social relation between people engaged in the
Yeah, the rest of this lecture is pretty dog shit. But there we go. So, TLDR, what is a commodity? A commodity is something that satisfies a human need. It has a use value. It has an exchange value. All commodities have to have an exchange value because there are things that in prior times had use values that were not commodities. I make crops for myself. There's no exchange value to that. That's not a commodity. I make a coat for a commune. There's no exchange value in that. That's not a commodity. In a capitalist market, I create books or I make gallons of water, take them to market for an exchange value, right? That's what makes it a commodity. But in order to get a raw good to the place of it being exchangeable, I have to put labor into it, whatever it may be. Everything necessitates labor. All commodities necessitate labor. This means that value is deriving from the labor, right? As a result of that, and this is demonstrably true, I could eventually, there's a document being worked on, I will release demonstrable evidence of the labor theory of value. But as a result of that, anytime anyone steals from my labor, if a capitalist takes 20% of what I put in, or I earned as a result of my labor by taking a raw good to an exchangeable good, that is theft, right? Boom. Labor theory of value, true and epic. There we go. There was something else I needed to cover on TLDR. Oh yeah. Well, what if I dig a mud pie? Not all rectangles are squares, but all squares are rectangles. Quote of the day. Not all labor is valuable, but everything that is valuable necessitates labor. Not all labor is valuable, but everything that is valuable necessitates labor. Unless like you get far more nuanced to a point where like it is a commodity, like the commodity form is dominating all walks of life, and as a result of that, there can be things that are arbitrarily designated as like valuable in their price, not actually as a result of value derived from anything, but in their price because they could be a means of production, or two, more scarce than other sorts of mediums. But that's just like, how do you respond to the ECP? Dude, once again, I don't care about the ECP. You're making the tautological claim that basically saying only value creates value. What do you think I mean by value, dude? The ECP is goated. Dude, I've read your comments before. You definitely do not know what the ECP is. Human nature is what you make. Yeah, human nature is reflective of a material condition in concurrence with existence. Human nature is not actually innate beyond like a drive to eat, reproduce, and sleep. I can't read capitalism's comments. I can only read them vacuously. How do we make a quantification of what we determine valuable? I know Marx describes as quantification. Oh, dude. First chapter of Capital. I don't know what medium of value you're trying to refer to there, but Marx differentiates between quantification and qualification. So, like, I think you're trying to allude to use value. I just do recommend reading the first chapter of Capital, but basically the distinction here is that something can be qualitative without being quantified, right? So qualitative value, it can be subjective in nature, but it doesn't take away from its existence. You know the ECP is a critique of communism, not capitalism? Yes, what the fuck? The same way that, like, if in an abortion argument, right, I'm like, oh, well, I think that subjective value is what derives, like, value to life. Then you're like, well, would you value an elephant more than a fetus because it's more subjectively experienced? Like, that's not actually a point of contention. Like, I'm making a qualitative claim, not a quantitative claim. Like, there needs to be no empiricism to it, especially if it's something that is vested in, like, a societal construct that is in many ways arbitrarily drawn, and value is derived very subjectively in that nature. It's just, like, universally something that is qualitative. Do you get rid of exchange values? You abolish the commodity form. This is the cover of Capital for whoever asks. This edition I would not buy. It has too many useless fucking prefaces. Are you a Marxist or Christian? Aren't they mutually exclusive? No, they're not mutually exclusive. I don't know how you came to that conclusion. Why is theory so gatekept and difficult to understand? Theory is gatekept because like dumbasses can walk away with the wrong interpretation. Like, how do you think the Austrian school became a thing? Jokes. Although I do regard most Austrians as dumbasses. Probably not like in positions of, I suppose, not authority, but regarded as intellectuals. So basically, here's the way I look at it, right? So we are laymen, right? We're pretty fucking dumb. Like, everyone on TikTok is pretty fucking dumb. But yet, still, like, Austrians are the laughingstock, right? And someone like Mises, right, would slaughter me in any sort of discussion. But that's not because that's because I'm not an intellectual, right? But in the case of intellectuals, he was brushed off as a joke, right? Austrian economists, people don't take them serious. Like the praxeological method, people in intellectual fields don't take them serious. The same way, like at a layman scale, I don't take them serious. What are you saying, dude? Basically, what I'm trying to get at is, although individuals like Mises, right, and Hayek, actually, I don't want to group in Hayek with the rest of them. Rothbard, right? Mises and Rothbard. Yes, they are infinitely smarter than me and would absolutely make a mockery of me on pretty much any ethical or economic prescription. But they're the laughingstock of their realm of intellectualism. I would consider that people would regard these people as intellectuals, but they were the laughingstock of their intellectuals, their clique in many instances, I suppose. The same way the average person probably regarded William F. Buckley as an intellectual, and the same with Noam Chomsky. But William F. Buckley was the laughingstock of Noam Chomsky. I have read Anatomy of the State. Parts, at least. Every time I get on a flight, I'm like, this time's the time that I'll read Anatomy of the State. And then I get into, like, the first chapter, and I'm like, God, this is fucking insufferable. Alright, I'm gonna go live again in a bit, like, probably in a few hours. On Omegle and then on my Twitch, but for now I'm done.